The autumn of 1886 was a season of endings for Elara Vance. It had taken her husband in the spring, a fever that burned through the valley like a prairie fire. And it had taken her cabin in late summer, a stray spark from the forge that consumed the dry timber of their small life in a single afternoon. Now, with her son David clutching her skirts and the first cold winds sharpening their teeth on the high peaks, she was left with nothing but a deed to the one property no one else wanted, the Holloway place. It was not a house so much as a monument to arrogance, a two-story stone structure built by a speculator from the east who believed the railroad would spawn a city on this windswept plain. The railroad had chosen a different valley. The speculator had gone bankrupt, and the house had stood empty for a decade, its thick stone walls earning it the name Holloway's Folly, or, more grimly among the locals, the Icebox. It was known to be a place that could not be heated, a tomb that leached warmth faster than any stove could produce it, its stones acting as a direct conduit for the brutal Colorado winter. Yet, as the other settlers in the small community of Providence Flats began their frantic, familiar rituals of preparation, chinking walls with fresh mud and straw, banking earth against their foundations, and laying in mountains of cordwood, Elara Vance did none of these things. Her neighbors watched her from a distance, their gazes a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. They saw the thin column of smoke from the Folly's chimney, a sign she and the boy had moved in, but they did not see the frantic stockpiling of fuel that survival demanded. Instead, they saw something inexplicable. Armed with a spade and a wheelbarrow her late husband Thomas had engineered, Elara was not banking earth against the house. She was digging it away. Day after day, from dawn until the light failed, she worked on the north and west sides of the stone structure, the two faces that would bear the brunt of the winter winds. She was digging a trench, a great earthen wound that grew steadily deeper and wider, exposing the rough-hewn foundation stones to the crisping air. To any sane observer, she was doing the exact opposite of what was necessary, inviting the cold into the very bones of her home. It was Amos Kelleher who finally rode over, his sense of communal duty overriding his reluctance to interfere. He was a practical man, his face a roadmap of hard-won knowledge etched by sun and frost. He saw the world in terms of what worked and what did not, and he had seen two families try and fail to survive a winter in this house. He reined in his horse, the leather creaking in the quiet air, and watched for a long moment as Elara, her face smudged with dirt and her dress hemmed with mud, levered another load of heavy soil into the barrow. Her movements were economical, weary but not defeated. She did not seem like a woman undone by grief. She seemed like a woman possessed by a purpose he could not fathom. He dismounted, his boots sinking slightly into the mound of excavated earth that now stood taller than he was. "Mrs. Vance," he began, his voice raspy with concern. "A word, if you please." Elara paused, resting the spade against the wall of the trench, and looked up. She shielded her eyes from the low sun, her expression patient, expectant. "Amos," she acknowledged simply. "It is good of you to call." He gestured with a gloved hand toward the vast ditch she had created. "Forgive me for speaking plainly, but what is it you are doing here? The ground will freeze 5 feet deep come January. Every bit of stone you uncover now will be another door for the cold to get in. You should be piling this dirt against the house, not digging it away. The thicker the bank, the warmer the floor." He was not being unkind. He was stating a fact as fundamental to him as the rising of the sun. It was the collective wisdom of every winter ever survived on that high, unforgiving plain. Elara wiped a stray strand of hair from her forehead with the back of a soiled wrist. She looked from Amos's earnest, worried face to the deep shadow line in her trench. She had expected this visit, this question. She had rehearsed the answer in her mind, though she knew the words would likely be as useless as seeds thrown on frozen ground. "The warmth I need is not in a bank of dirt, Mr. Kelleher," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "It is deeper. The frost is the enemy, but the frost has its limits. I am not inviting the cold in. I am building a wall against it, where it truly lives." Amos stared at her, his brow furrowed in confusion. The words made no sense. Deeper warmth? A wall under the ground? It sounded like the ramblings of a mind cracked by loss. He saw the madness of it all. A lone woman digging a moat around a house that was already a fortress of cold. His wife Dora had said as much just that morning, her voice laced with the sorrowful pity reserved for the hopeless. "That poor woman," Dora had sighed over breakfast. "The grief has taken her senses, digging her own foundation out. She and that boy will be frozen solid by the first snow." Amusement was a safer position than outright pity, and it was with this sense of bewildered concern that Amos tried again. "The earth freezes, Mrs. Vance. It becomes like iron. There is no warmth down there." Elara offered a small, tired smile. It did not reach her eyes. "There is," she said, "if you go deep enough." She knew it was no use. Watching an outcome is not the same as understanding the principle. Explaining the physics of the earth to a man who lived entirely upon its surface was like describing the color blue to one born blind. He saw only the immediate, the tactile, the proven methods of his fathers. He could not see the invisible forces she was attempting to harness. He patted her shoulder, a gesture of awkward sympathy. "I will send my boys over tomorrow," he offered. "They are strong lads. They can have a proper earth bank built for you in a day. And they can help you chop and stack some more wood. Your pile is looking mighty low for a house this size." He saw her small wood pile as further proof of her folly, a sign she was unprepared in every conceivable way. He did not understand that her small pile was part of the same careful calculation as the trench. He left, shaking his head, convinced he would be leading the party to retrieve 2 frozen bodies before Christmas. That evening, with David asleep in a small bed she had tucked into the warmest corner of the cavernous kitchen, Elara sat by the meager fire and let her husband's memory fill the room. Thomas had not been a farmer or a rancher. He had been a geologist, a man who carried books filled with diagrams of rock strata and thermal gradients. He had been endlessly fascinated by the unseen world beneath their feet. He saw the land not as a surface to be worked, but as a complex, layered machine. She remembered one afternoon, years before, sitting on a bluff overlooking a vast prairie dog town. Thomas had been explaining, with an almost boyish excitement, how the creatures survived the bitterest winters without fire or fur-lined coats. He had sketched in his notebook, the charcoal pencil flying across the page. "Look here, Elara," he had said, pointing to a cross-section of a burrow. "See how deep they go? They dig below the frost line. That's the secret. Up here," he tapped the drawing of the surface, "the temperature can swing 100 degrees from summer to winter. But down here," his finger traced the line of the deep burrow, "the temperature of the earth is nearly constant. It stays around 50 degrees year-round. It's the earth's own slow warmth, a vast, stable reservoir of heat. The animals don't generate much heat of their own. They simply move to a place where the cold cannot reach them. Nature doesn't fight the winter, my love. It finds the place where winter isn't." He had then looked over at the distant silhouette of Holloway's Folly, a dark shape against the sky. That house, he had mused, is a masterclass in ignorance. Holloway built it like a castle on a temperate English moor. He sank his foundation only 3 feet deep. The frost here goes down 6. It gets under his walls, freezes the ground solid right beneath his floors, and turns those beautiful stone walls into pillars of ice. He built a house that actively invites the cold to live inside it. That was the principle. The secret knowledge that the community, for all its practical wisdom, lacked. They fought the winter in the air, a battle they could only ever temporarily win with massive amounts of fuel. Elara was choosing not to fight that battle at all. She was going to separate her home from the winter, just as a prairie dog separates its sleeping chamber from the blizzard raging only a few feet above. Her trench was not a moat to let the cold in. It was the first step in creating a buffer zone, an insulated corridor of stable, subterranean air that would shield her foundation from the killing frost. She was attempting to wrap her house in the earth's slow, constant warmth. When she had tried to explain the frost line to Amos Kelleher, his eyes had glazed over. He understood frost on a pump handle, not as a creeping, subterranean enemy that had to be outmaneuvered. Her explanation had sounded like a fairy tale, and his offer to chop wood felt like a final, gentle dismissal of her sanity. The work was brutal. The late autumn sun offered little warmth, and a persistent wind clawed at her, stealing the heat of her labor. She dug until her hands were raw, until her back screamed in protest, until the muscles in her arms and shoulders burned with a fire that did not warm her. The trench grew, a testament to her singular, unyielding focus. It ran the full length of the north wall, turned the corner, and continued down the entire west wall, a massive L-shaped excavation that was now over 6 feet deep and 4 feet wide. She had hit the caliche layer, a hard pan of natural cement that forced her to use a heavy iron pry bar, chipping away at it inch by painstaking inch. David, too young to help with the heavy work, played nearby, gathering interesting stones or chasing grasshoppers, his presence a constant, quiet reminder of why she could not fail. Once the trench was complete, the second phase of construction began. With the wheelbarrow, she made dozens of trips to the dry creek bed a 1/4 mile away, hauling back smooth, rounded stones. These she laid carefully in the bottom of the trench, creating a French drain to wick away any moisture that might seep in. Then came the most crucial part. She did not simply backfill the trench. Instead, against the cold stone of the house's foundation, she began to build a second interior wall. She used salvaged timbers for posts and rough sawn planks she had scavenged from a collapsed shed. This new wall stood 2 feet away from the foundation, creating a wide air gap, a subterranean corridor that was the heart of her design. The process was slow, the fitting of each plank a challenge for her exhausted body. The air in the trench was still and cold, smelling of damp earth and raw wood. It was a tomb-like space, and sometimes, alone in the depths of it, a flicker of doubt would assail her. She was staking her life, and her son's life, on a theory, on a conversation held on a sunny afternoon years ago. Finally, she built the roof for her corridor. She laid thick timbers across the gap, from the top of her wooden wall to the earth bank on the other side. On top of the timbers, she layered scavenged planks, then a thick coating of pitch Thomas had left in a barrel, and finally, she laid sod, cut in heavy squares from the prairie. She packed the seams with mud and clay, creating a low, long, living roof that sloped gently away from the house. When she was finished, it looked as if the prairie itself had risen up to embrace the north and west walls of her home. a gentle green rampart against the coming storm. Two small, heavily insulated hatches, one at each end of the corridor, were the only openings. To the casual observer, it now looked as if she had simply done what Amos had advised, banking earth against her home, albeit in an unusually tidy and elaborate fashion. But she knew the truth was in the hollow space beneath, in the unmoving, untroubled air trapped between the deep earth and her home. The first blizzard arrived in the second week of December. It did not come gently. The sky turned the color of slate, the temperature plummeted, and a wind rose out of the north that the old-timers called a blue norther, a scouring, malevolent force that seemed to want to strip the very flesh from the world. In Providence Flats, families huddled inside their cabins, the stoves roaring, the windows rattling, the familiar sounds of a world under siege. In their thoughts, between prayers for their own safety, many spared a moment of grim pity for the widow and her boy in the Folly. They pictured her struggling to feed a ravenous fire, the heat sucked away by those cursed stone walls as fast as she could produce it, the icy drafts killing the flames. They imagined her despair as her small woodpile dwindled to nothing. Inside the Folly, Elara waited. The wind howled around the stone corners of the house, a sound like a hungry animal. Snow began to hiss against the windows on the south and east walls, but on the north and west walls, there was a strange quiet. The great stone walls were no longer resonating with the gale. The house felt less like a sieve and more like a fortress. She had to trust the process, trust the principle her husband had taught her. The outcome was invisible, hidden in the dark, earthen corridor outside. There was no immediate feedback, no gauge to tell her if it was working. There was only the waiting and the deep, abiding faith she had placed in her own hands and in the immutable laws of the natural world. Her actions were a study in quiet confidence. She did not feed the stove until it glowed red hot, as the other settlers were surely doing. She kept only a small, steady fire going, enough to keep a pot of stew simmering and to take the worst of the chill from the air. Her small woodpile, which Amos had seen as a sign of her impending doom, was a crucial part of her strategy. She knew she did not have enough fuel to fight the Colorado winter head-on, so she had designed a system that did not require a pitched battle. She was not trying to heat the entire house to a comfortable warmth. She was merely trying to keep the vast thermal mass of the stone walls from becoming a heat sink, from actively pulling the life out of the room. Her goal was not comfort. Her goal was a stable equilibrium, a pocket of survivable air in a world of lethal cold. She was tending her system with the patient understanding of its creator, adding a single log every hour, her movements calm and methodical, a stark contrast to the frantic struggle she knew was happening in the cabins across the flats. For 3 days, the blizzard raged. The world outside was a churning chaos of white. On the morning of the 4th day, the wind finally abated, leaving behind a world transformed, buried under a deep, silent blanket of snow. The cold, however, remained. It was a dry, searing cold that cracked wood and made the very air seem brittle. Elara knew this was the moment of truth. She bundled David in his warmest clothes and then pulled on her own coat and gloves. When she opened the heavy oak door, the cold hit her with a physical force. It stole her breath and stung her eyes. The snow was drifted halfway up the door, a solid, sculpted wall of white. But it was the frost that was most shocking. Every surface was coated in a thick, crystalline layer of it. The door latch, the hinges, the wood of the doorframe itself, all were covered in delicate, deadly feathers of ice. This was the cold that killed. After a few moments, she closed the main door and walked to the north wall of the kitchen, to the small, square hatch she had built into the floor. It was her access to the subterranean corridor. With a grunt of effort, she heaved it open. She lit a lantern and lowered it into the darkness. A puff of air rose to meet her, and she braced herself for the same biting cold she had felt outside. But it was not the same. The air that wafted up was not warm, not by any measure, but it was profoundly different. It was still, silent, and damp. It smelled of deep earth, of clay and stone, and the faint, clean scent of wintering roots. It was the air of a cellar, of a place untouched by the wind and the fury of the storm. It was survivable air. She knelt, reached down and placed her bare hand flat against the interior stone wall, the one that formed the other side of her corridor. The stone was cool, deeply cool, but it was not the life-leeching, ice-impregnated cold of the stones on the exposed southern wall. There was no frost on its surface. It felt like a stone on a cool spring day, not one that had endured 3 days of a sub-zero blizzard. She pressed her cheek against it and felt its solid, neutral presence. It was not giving warmth, but crucially, it was not stealing it either. The air gap and the stable temperature of the deep earth had effectively disconnected this part of her house from the winter. She had done it. Her theory was sound. Her labor had not been in vain. A slow, quiet triumph filled her, a feeling more profound than any loud celebration. She had not conquered the winter. She had simply stepped out of its way. In that moment of quiet vindication, Thomas's voice was as clear in her mind as if he were standing beside her. "The folly isn't the problem," he had once told her, tapping a finger on a drawing of the house. "The stone is just stone. The problem is its relationship with the ground. It's built on the frozen skin of the world. If you could just change that relationship, give it a new foundation that starts below the frost, you wouldn't have to heat the house. You'd only have to warm the air inside it." She had changed the relationship. She had built a new foundation of stable air and earth around the old one. She had listened to the principle, trusted the process, and created a small pocket of equilibrium in a world of extremes. It was a victory of understanding over brute force, of knowledge over tradition. The blizzard had crippled the settlement. Drifts buried fences and blocked doors. For 2 days after the wind stopped, there was only the slow, arduous work of digging out. On the 3rd day, a figure appeared, struggling through the deep snow toward the Folly. It was Amos Kelleher. He had a shovel over his shoulder and a grim, determined look on his face. He had waited as long as his conscience would allow. Convinced that no fire could have lasted this long, he had come for the grim task of digging out the widow and her son. He expected to find a silent, frozen house. He pounded on the door, his fist making a dull thud in the profound silence. He waited, then pounded again, shouting her name. When the door swung open, the sight that greeted him stopped him cold. Elara Vance stood there, a mending basket in her hand. Behind her, the boy David was sitting at the kitchen table, drawing on a piece of slate. The air that flowed out of the house was not warm and toasty, but it was not the tomb-like cold he had expected. It was simply calm. He looked past her and saw the stove, a single log burning placidly within it, the stovepipe barely warm. His eyes darted around the room, searching for the trick, the explanation. He saw the thick frost coating the inside of the south-facing window, yet Elara wore no coat, only a shawl over her dress. "Mrs. Vance," he stammered, his breath pluming in the air between them. How are you not frozen? Your fire, it is barely going." Elara stepped back and gestured for him to come inside. "My fire does not have to fight the stone, Mr. Kelleher," she said simply. She led him to the north wall, the one he had been so sure would be her undoing. "Place your hand here." He hesitated, then pressed his palm against the massive stone blocks. His face, already weathered and creased, contorted in disbelief. The stone was merely cool. He snatched his hand back as if burned, then walked to the east wall and touched it. That stone was frigid, slick with a thin film of interior frost, leaching heat from the air. He turned back to her, his mind struggling to reconcile what his senses were telling him with a lifetime of experience. She then led him to the hatch in the floor and opened it. He peered down into the dark, feeling the still, cellar-like air on his face. He saw the inner wooden wall, the 4-foot gap, the foundation stones free of any ice. He did not understand the physics, but he could not deny the result. He looked from the open hatch to her calm face, and the certainty of his own hard-won wisdom crumbled into dust. He finally straightened up, meeting her eyes. The pity was gone, replaced by a deep and unsettling respect. "I'll be," he said, his voice a low whisper of awe. "You did it, Mrs. Vance. You truly did it." Word of the miracle at Holloway's Folly spread as soon as the paths were cleared. It was first spoken of as luck, then as some strange woman's magic. But Amos Kelleher, a man whose word carried the weight of proven good sense, corrected the narrative. It was not luck, he told the men gathered at the blacksmith's forge, and it was not magic. It was a principle. She dug the winter out from around her house. In the spring, when the ground thawed, he and 3 other men came to Elara's door, their hats in their hands. They did not come with offers of charity or pity. They came with questions. She took them to the sod-covered berm, now green with new grass, and opened the hatches. She showed them the construction, the drain, the crucial air gap. She explained the frost line, using a stick to draw a diagram in the dirt, just as Thomas had once done for her. They listened in silence, their faces intent, seeing the elegant, powerful logic of it for the first time. They were practical men, and they had just been shown a better practice. The legacy of Elara's Trench was etched into the very architecture of Providence Flats. That next autumn, no fewer than 4 families undertook the massive labor of digging their own Vance cellars, as they came to be called, wrapping their vulnerable foundations in a protective cloak of earth-warmed air. The winters that followed were still harsh, the winds still blew, but the frantic, desperate consumption of firewood lessened. Homes that had once been barely survivable became secure. Holloway's Folly, once a name synonymous with failure and death, became the standard by which all other homes were measured for warmth and safety. Elara Vance, the quiet widow whom the community had pitied, became its source of new wisdom. For nearly a century the house stood, its lower walls embraced by the earth, a silent, enduring testament to a woman who faced a terrible winter, not with more wood or a bigger fire, but with a deeper understanding, a trust in a principle she had learned from a man who loved the secrets hidden beneath the surface of the world.